Okay, I'm going to come over here to Mr. Holding, who said we could call him JP. Is that okay?
No, I changed my mind.
Okay, what would you like?
Mary. That was your joke.
Now you realize that even though we're going to be equal on both sides, we're on the same team when you make me look stupid right now. I'm kidding. Okay. Would you just take a moment, talk about yourself, and talk about what you've been up to, and give a little bit of background?
What haven't I been up to these days? I've been working on several books right now, self-published efforts, educational efforts. I've been working on a lot of YouTube videos, involving a lot of cartoon and artwork. I've been writing blogs, 2 of them, maybe count 3 of them total. And I've been on a plane with screaming kids today, so I'm really wired. That's about it.
Thank you very much. This is Dr. Carrier. He has agreed to come up from the Bay Area. What part, actually?
Richmond.
Richmond, okay. And I've been in Christian ministry my whole life, and I have to tell you, there are days when I wonder if God actually does exist. And I mean that sincerely. Sometimes I feel that I'm praying, or I'm believing, or I'm trusting, and I actually have doubts about it. And I'm really excited to have Dr. Carrier here. For those of you that know him, he has a rich background, and I'm going to ask him, just like I did Mr. Holding, to just talk about what he's been up to and what's going on.
Okay, yes. I'm actually known for 2 different tracks that I've gone on in my life. One is philosophy and one is ancient history. I'm best known for my book, Sense and Goodness Without God, which I'm selling out there. What's different about that is the fact that I'm looking to create and advocate a positive worldview for atheists. So basically, the question is, okay, maybe we don't believe God doesn't exist, or we don't believe God exists, but then what philosophy should we have? How should we live our life? What kind of morals should we have? What kind of politics should we have? What exists? What should we believe? So I'm known for actually advocating that as a positive worldview without God in it. Well, at the same time, my actual formal education is in intellectual history. I got my PhD at Columbia University in ancient science and religion. I'm actually working on books right now, Science Education in the Early Roman Empire and The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire. That's my particular passion, but I also know a lot about early Christianity, and of course I've been asked to talk and speak about this issue. And regarding the particular issue today, this is one of the subjects that I spent many years studying at Columbia University, although originally not studying the Bible, but particularly studying ancient texts and textual transmission in general. And later on I learned how to apply that to the Bible as well. And that's it. So.
Thank you, Dr. Carey, for coming up. Thank you, JP, for coming up from the other side of the country. Okay, what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and kick this thing off, and it's going to be timed, so if you see me telling a speaker to slow down or stop, it's no disrespect. We have to keep time frame around it. And what we're going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and the topic discussion is the New Testament reliable? And so that speaks for itself. You know, the foundation of Christianity is based largely a part of the New Testament, and I'm going to go ahead and invite Mr. Holding to come up, and he has 15 minutes for his opening statement.
Good evening. How's everyone? The question at hand regarding the New Testament tonight is, do we have what they had? And to answer this question in the affirmative is going to require some background. I'm going to start with some non-debatable matters set in 3 standard points. And what you're about to hear is very dull and is generally conceded as true by everyone, except maybe Dan Brown and people who think professional wrestling is real. First standard point is that the New Testament ranks as superior to other documents in terms of available evidence. This refers first of all to number of available ancient manuscripts. I checked this number last month. It was at 5,790 Greek manuscripts, and that will change now and then as new discoveries are made. It's also standard to add in around 20,000 manuscripts in other languages, plus over 1 million quotes from early church writers, from which it is said we could reconstruct the entire New Testament if all those manuscripts vanished down a hole. Second standard point, the gap between the earliest manuscripts and the time the New Testament was composed is relatively small, on the order of about 100 to 200 years. Now, there are debates current right now about the date of the earliest scrap of the New Testament, but in general it is conceded that the earliest substantial manuscripts come from between 200 to 300 years after the original composition time of the New Testament. Now, both this and the first point I gave are used comparatively. That is, compared to other ancient works, we have a wealth of textual evidence to help us reconstruct the original New Testament text. Many ancient works have manuscript totals you can count on one hand and come from at earliest maybe hundreds or thousands of years past the original time of composition. And so the general conclusion is we have to accept that we can reconstruct the New Testament reliably, or else agree that we can't reconstruct any document reliably from the ancient world. Now, to set the stage for the third point, I need to make a few words about the process of textual criticism, the science of using copies and manuscripts to arrive at a conclusion about the contents of the original text. No one thinks that textual criticism gives us 100% certainty that we reconstructed the original text of an ancient document. There can be a fair amount of inference and conjecture involved. However, with sufficient evidence, textual criticism is usually regarded as being able to give us a sufficient degree of certainty about the substance, if not the exact words, of a text, such that it can be used as a historical source. Now I'd like to discuss a couple of principles in a very simple format used by textual critics to do their work. Just to cite an example of the process, it's not as simple as counting manuscripts to decide which reading is correct. If we have 9,000 manuscripts, and 4,000 say Peter ate fish, 5,000 say Peter ate liver, the natural assumption is to say that the winner is Peter ate liver. But if the 4,000 manuscripts that say Peter ate fish date from 300 to 500 AD, while the 5,000 that say Peter ate liver date from 800 to 1,000 AD, then the minority reading may have a better chance of being the original. Number of manuscripts can be a deciding factor in knowing which reading is better, but the date of a reading is also an important consideration. Another typical guideline is that if a reading is longer than another, the shorter one is given more consideration because, as a rule, when mistakes in copying are made, they tend to make a text longer rather than shorter. So if we have two readings that are otherwise of equal value, Peter ate liver versus Peter ate liver and onions, the shorter one will tend to be given preference. Now that's just a very small and very simplified example of how the process works. We could spend hours talking about that process in detail, but you don't want that. Instead, let's go on to our last point. Among all those Greek manuscripts, there are a great number of variants or differences. Those who copied the New Testament in the early years, of course, copied by hand, and they were not perfect. They made mistakes. How many? Well, no one has an exact count, but I've seen estimates ranging from 300,000 to over 1 million. Is that a big deal? Well, the third standard point says not so much as we may think. All will agree that the vast majority of these variants are very simple matters of spelling, or what we might call typos, simple things like that. Another chunk of those variants involves things like use of synonymous words or transpositions. Yet another chunk includes variants that are so absurd or obscure that no one thinks they could possibly represent what was originally written. So what's left? In terms of things we have no certainty what the original reading was, about 1% of those. And this standard point is sealed with a provision that none of that 1% has anything to do with what affects the nuts and bolts of the Christian faith, that affects people who come to this church every week. There's plenty of arcana for textual scholars to debate about, but nothing the average churchgoer will care about. I've come to the end of the non-debatable data. And given that all this is non-debatable, what can be said by those who might answer tonight's question with either a no or a we don't know? Well, we'll hear about that soon enough, but let me give you an idea of what is argued by some who hold this view. Initially, it might be pointed out that although the New Testament is superior to other ancient texts in terms of hard manuscript evidence, that gap of around 200 years does exist, and a lot could happen in that time. Then it will be pointed out that there is evidence of purposeful changes in the text, in the manuscripts that we do have. And so the conclusion in general is an extrapolation. Because Christian scribes were changing the text later, arguably, they were changing the text earlier. And thus we have a justified uncertainty about the original contents of the New Testament. That's one way of putting it. And then there's a somewhat more radical way of arguing this point, as in this extended quote. The Gospels were written with an agenda, a deliberate aim to persuade and turn people toward belief in Christ and the embrace of Christian morals. We know they were written long after Paul's epistles by members of a fanatical cult who believed their dreams were communications from God, that their intuition was guided by the Holy Spirit, and that they could find information about Jesus secretly hidden in the Bible, and whose leaders regularly hallucinated, occasionally lied, and often fabricated documents. They also doctored them. Examples of the doctrine given include, but are not limited to, the following. We know Mark did not write verses 16:9 through 20. Those were snuck in later by dishonest Christians. Another example of John 8:1 through 11. That's now known to be a forgery. It was deceitfully inserted after the fact. And so on, the conclusion relates specifically first to the book of Acts. We have no way of knowing what got added to the version we now have in the Bible, or indeed any of the other Gospels or epistles, or what was changed or taken away for that matter. That, as offered in John Loftus's book, The Christian Delusion, in a chapter written by Richard Carrier. The emphasis on fanaticism and deceit involves a number of propositions about the origins of the New Testament and Christianity that could be debated over several hours. But tonight the question at hand is limited to whether these documents being copied by reputedly fanatical, deceitful, and so on people is sufficient to say that the manuscript and textual evidence won't help us very much. However the matter is argued, it amounts to charging early Christian copyists with running a forgery ring. So under the legal understanding of forgery, I will ask or pose three questions. First question, were the changes pervasive? This is the ring part of the forgery ring, multiple participants. A case for tampering extending into the unknown textual period requires the establishment of a pattern significant enough to extrapolate from later to earlier. It must be shown that the practice of scribal activity was fundamentally oriented and institutionalized towards tampering with the text. Second question, were the changes malicious? At the heart of a forgery charge is intention to deceive. Were scribes indeed trying to fool readers into thinking the original text said something it did not? Final question, were the changes meaningful? There can be discussions, of course, about what meaningful is, but that's another matter. That can take hours to debate in and of itself. It remains to be seen what we'll hear in opposition tonight, but it's worth pointing out what's said by Bart Ehrman in his popular book, He's Quoting Jesus. Ehrman was asked, why do you believe these core tenets of Christian orthodoxy to be in jeopardy based on the scribal errors you discovered? In this question, comparison was made to the stance of Ehrman's mentor, contextual scholar Bruce Metzger, who had always said on these matters what I said earlier. Nothing in the variants changes or threatens the nuts and bolts. To this, Ehrman answered that when it came to the state of the original text, he and Metzger, if they had to hammer out a consensus on what the original text probably looked like, would have very few points of disagreement, maybe one or two places out of thousands. Ehrman also indicates that his stance does not actually stand at odds with Metzger's position, that essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition. So to sum up, there's a significant burden to fulfill if a case is to be made for unknown, unattested, malicious, and meaningful tampering with the New Testament in the centuries for which we have no hard manuscript evidence. My answer to the central question tonight, do we have what they had, is we can have a high certainty that the substance has been accurately related to us, somewhat less, but still significant confidence on the particulars of the words. And I would place the burden on those who would say otherwise to show otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll have a rebuttal from Dr. Carrier.
All right, testing this. How's that sound? Everybody can hear me? Excellent. Okay, I pretty much agree with everything JP said. His facts are all correct. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the other side of the coin here. We're going to start here All right, it's not working, so I'm going to have to signal you. Okay. Next slide. Yes, there we go. The first problem is that all scholars agree that no manuscript we have reflects the original, and all are quite divergent from it. The text in modern Bibles is a hypothetical creation of 20th century scholars, as JP himself said. But scholars are often wrong in their judgments. Many of their decisions are dubious or debatable. You can find examples of this in even JP's writings, where he admits and even argues against main scholarly conclusions. In fact, they often disagree with each other and admit to being uncertain about countless of their textual decisions. The New Testament text is therefore a product of fallible human opinions. Problem number 2. This means for about 2,000 years, Christians had the wrong Bible, a New Testament full of errors and distortions. Modern Bibles are better, but still print readings that we know are false and fail to mention hundreds of cases where the original reading is uncertain or disputed. And you can't just assume the reconstructed text is the correct text, because scholars remain in disagreement and uncertain about many points. So you do have to be suspicious or careful when arguing from the text of the New Testament, especially if you're turning on a specific word that was used, for example. Next. Now you can't see, it's a shame, you can't see this slide very well. This black spot is actually supposed to be a beautiful red curtain, but anyway. Our significant manuscripts start around 200 AD. Before that, we have only a few tiny scraps. That means literally about 24 scattered verses and the first chapter of Revelation, and that's it. So in this period, we have at least 100 years. Back then, that was about 2 average lifetimes, in which we can't see what was happening to the text. And JP mentioned that as well. And when I said scraps, let's go to the next. I mean scraps. That's an example of it. Just a few little words there. Next, please. Thank you. Now, the third problem is the rate of error and distortion in the visible period. We can actually document this by looking at the manuscript edition. For about 200 to 600 AD is actually very high. By 600 AD, about 5 to 10% of the text is wrong. It's not what we can reconstruct it was before 200 AD, for example. The rate of error behind the curtain can be expected to be no less. Therefore, there must have been many changes behind the curtain that won't show in any of the surviving manuscripts. In fact, the minimum rate of distortion would be 1% per century. So for the first 100 years, at least 1 in 100 verses will have been distorted before we get any manuscripts to detect these changes. Next slide, please. Oh, we're on the wrong battery. There we go. So on the your right side, we have the visible period from about 200 AD on, when we can sort of see what's happening with the manuscript. But on the other side, we have this curtain, where this invisible period, where we can't see what was happening to the text during the first 100 years. The fourth problem. We know most changes to a text occur in the first century of its transmission because, number one, it is then much easier to get away with it or to make an error that goes unnoticed or uncorrected. Number two, the quality of scribes that work on the Bible in its first 2 centuries has been proven to be substantially inferior to the professional quality of later centuries. And number three, you can have a curve showing the stability of the New Testament text over the first 12 centuries. It shows the stability increasing every century, which entails that stability was the worst in the first century than in any following century, precisely the century invisible to us. Next, please. And so this gives you that idea, graphing sort of to show you visually that the rate of error is worse in this period that we can't see. Next. So it's behind this curtain is where we can't see what's going on, and yet that's where the fastest rate of errors is occurring. Next, please. Now, there are lots of ways distortions enter the text, and in fact, there's deletions is actually one thing that Holding did sort of allow for the possibility of, but it's worth pointing out that there are deletions as one of the possible things. But I'm only going to talk about 3 different kinds of ways that distortions enter. And the first is harmonizations. Scribes often changed one gospel to agree with another, for example, making Matthew agree with Luke or Luke with John. We've caught hundreds of cases occurring in the first 2 centuries after the curtain. So the question is, how many occurred behind the curtain? This can't be said to be trivial. It matters a great deal if the gospels originally disagreed with each other. If the Gospels have all been harmonized to some extent, then we can't claim that we have what they originally had, certainly not exactly. Next, please. An example is this. Many early manuscripts, including our earliest complete New Testaments, both Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, have Matthew agree with John that Jesus was struck by a soldier's spear and out came blood and water. Now we have manuscripts showing that this was an assertion, but how many such edits were made behind the curtain? We can identify at least 100 such harmonizations in the first 500 years for which we have manuscripts. Therefore, there must be at least 20 more made in the first 100 years that are invisible to us. Next, please. It follows that any time you argue from the fact that 2 Gospels agree, you can't really know if that agreement was in the originals or fabricated later. Can't be certain. Next, please. The other one is interpolations. The number of passages added to the New Testament by later editors is huge compared to most other ancient books. Christians clearly had no scruple at all against doing this and did it frequently. 4 examples out of maybe 100 we know of are the passage about the adulteress, let he who was without sin cast the first stone, that was added. A comment about an angel stirring the pool of Bethesda, Jesus sweating blood, that was added later. There's a line added in manuscripts of Luke where the tomb door, for Jesus' tomb, the tomb door took 20 men to open. Christian added a line saying that. Next, please. One of the most famous examples is the ending of Mark. Earliest copies end at verse 16:8, in which Mark describes no appearances of the risen Jesus. It says, those who saw the empty tomb never told anyone. Now, there are 2 different endings were added later on, a short ending and a long ending. Scholars have proved neither was in the original. And scholars can't agree whether we've lost Mark's original ending or Mark really did end at 16:8. So experts don't know if we're missing a major part of Mark or not. And if we are, then we don't have what they have. Next. Now, some copies of Mark, at least by the 4th century, had also added this. And I'm going to read this so you have an idea of the sort of things Christians were willing to add to the text. Jesus reproached them for their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they had not believed those who had seen him after he had risen. And they defended themselves, saying, this world of lawlessness and unbelief is under Satan, who does not allow the unclean things that are under the spirits to comprehend God's true power. Because of this, reveal your righteousness now. They said these things to Christ, and Christ replied to them, the term of years of the authority of Satan has been fulfilled, but other dreadful things are drawing near, even to those for whose sake as sinners I was delivered up to death, so that they might return to the truth and no longer sin, and might inherit the spiritual and incorruptible glory of righteousness which is in heaven. So go into the world and preach the gospel to all creation. So some Christian added this whole piece to the Gospel of Mark. Next. Other copies of Mark by the 3rd century had also added this. When the women were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb? This was added. Then, all of a sudden, at the 3rd hour of the day, there was darkness over the whole earth, and angels descended from heaven. And as he rose up in the splendor of the living God, they ascended with him, and immediately it was light. So this was also added to the text. This means that within 2 or 3 centuries, 4 different interpolated endings have been added to Mark's text. The short ending, the long ending, the satanic powers ending, and the angelic miracle ending. Next, please. Mark's ending isn't the only example of this Christian willingness to add things to the text. There are 100 or so other cases. I've listed several already. But the most infamous after Mark is Luke and Acts, which accumulated so many interpolations that in each case, many manuscripts have a text that is 10% longer than our present version. So next, please. This shows Christians were adding whole material to their Bible with a readiness and frequency almost unprecedented for any other ancient text. And if this was occurring after the curtain, we should expect it was also occurring behind the curtain, when such changes would have been even easier to make. We've detected at least 100 of these insertions in the first 5 centuries for which we have manuscripts. So, statistically, there must have been at least 20 more made behind the curtain of the first 100 years, where we will have no manuscripts to detect them by. Next, please. Many experts believe 1 Corinthians 14, 34 to 35 is one of those. I know JP would contest me on this, but there are experts on my side and his. This passage has Paul command, let the women keep silence in the churches, because it is not permitted for them to speak, but let them be in subjection, as also the law says. And if they would learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in the church. Now, the 2 main reasons many scholars conclude that Paul didn't write this are that it directly contradicts what Paul says in the very same letter. He gives rules for when women speak in the church, so he obviously doesn't trust it. And Paul teaches we aren't under the Jewish law in this kind of way, so he wouldn't cite it as a precedent for forbidding women to speak. Next. Another example is where Paul refers to the end of the Jewish nation and its national cult, even though that occurred at least a decade after he is supposed to have died. This is in 1 Thessalonians, where Paul is made to say, in Judea, the Jews killed both the Lord Jesus and the prophets, and drove out us, and pleased not God, and are contrary to all men, forbidding us to speak to the Gentiles, that they may be saved, to fill up their sins always, but the wrath has come upon them to the uttermost. Now this again contradicts Paul's own teachings and beliefs. Paul never blames the Jews for the death of Jesus elsewhere. Paul never talks about God's wrath as having already come, but as coming only at the future judgment. And most importantly, Paul specifically teaches the Jews will be saved, not destroyed. Next slide. The significance of these. GP, like I said, will take a different view, as do some scholars, but I agree with many leading experts that these 2 passages are interpolations, and if they are, then we do not have what they had. Yet all surviving manuscripts have them, thus our modern reconstruction does not reconstruct the original text. And not all interpolations will be so sloppy or obvious. In fact, we should expect editors to have more commonly been smarter than that, So there must be other interpolations made behind the curtain that we can't detect. Next. Okay, last is spelling errors. The most common errors, numbering in the thousands, are spelling mistakes. Given the rate of spelling mistakes accumulated over the centuries, there must have been hundreds made behind the curtain, which are therefore undetectable to us now. Now, spelling errors are not trivial. They make substantial differences to the meaning of the text, and I'll give you an example next. Peace on earth and goodwill toward men. You may know this phrase, spoken by the angel at the Nativity. It was never in the original. The original said, peace on earth for men whom God pleases. A much less lofty and more ominous declaration. The famous but bogus line resulted from a simple spelling error. A single letter was accidentally dropped, and that's the change in the meaning of the sentence. In this case, we got lucky. We just happened to have manuscripts showing the original reading. But what if the mistake had been made years before that? Then we wouldn't even know about it. Statistically, there must have been many such errors behind the curtain. And spelling errors aren't that trivial. Here's some other ones. Is the number of the beast 666 or 616? We don't know. Did Paul teach the Corinthians the mystery of God, or the salvation of God, or the testimony of God? We don't know. Did Paul say, when justified by faith we have peace with God, or when justified by faith let us have peace with God? We don't know. Next. So in conclusion, the rate of significant spelling errors in the first 3 centuries of the manuscripts we have entails many such errors will have occurred behind the curtain and thus remain unknown to us now. The rate of interpolations in the first 3 centuries of the manuscripts we have entails many more will have occurred behind the curtain and thus remain unknown to us now. The rate of harmonizations in the first 3 centuries of the manuscripts we have entails many more will have occurred behind the curtain and thus remain unknown to us now. Next. Therefore, what we have is not what they had. Now, it may be most of it, but not all of it. And since we can't know what changes were made behind the curtain of its first 100 years, we can't trust the New Testament as an inerrant guide or source. Now, perhaps, how much time do I have left?
3 minutes.
3 minutes. I'll say something about generally how we treat other texts. As historians, we actually face this fact for all the ancient documents, almost all the ancient documents we have. They're all hosed to one degree or another. If you take Tacitus's Annals, for example, there's at least 1,000 places there, 1,000 in one book of Tacitus, where we don't know exactly what he said. We can kind of conjecture or guess. We're actually used to this. We're missing entire sections of Tacitus. There's whole pieces of Tacitus that are missing. And as historians, we just throw up our hands and go, well, whatever. We deal with what we have. And actually, there's a lot of cases where an uncertain reading, the scholar will recognize that and say, well, I can't make a confident conclusion here because of this uncertain reading. And even for other cases, what historians will say is, well, it's probably true. So maybe it's 99% confident. Which is good enough for doing history, but if you're using the Bible, for example, as a guide to a source of wisdom or a source of God's Word or something like that, that changes the scenario entirely. If, for example, if we had to send a guy to the moon using information in Tacitus, I would not get on that rocket. So I'm going to end there because I think we've both given you a lot of information, and I'm sure JP has some things to say as well. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carrier. Now we're going to have our time allotted for our guest is going to switch to 10 minutes. So I'm going to invite Mr. Holding to come up, and he is going to give a response time to 10 minutes.
Well, when Richard and I were talking earlier, I was telling him a lot of things about myself that he apparently didn't know, such as I draw cartoons. He never knew that. Here's something else he doesn't know. I don't think Paul wrote that passage in 1 Corinthians 14. I think he is quoting Corinthian opponents. That's exactly what I think he's doing, and that I think he therefore rebuts them. But I think what this might illustrate for us is that when it comes to textual criticism, the matter is not always as simple as the text by itself. There are so many other contexts we have to look at besides the text itself. Historical context, rhetorical context, social context, and so on, which I'm sure he does not disagree with at all. Now, in terms of my questions tonight, and in terms of what he said as to what answer might have been given. First of all, was it pervasive? Well, statistics don't often work neat and clean like that. We saw a graph saying, well, if it continued on this trend, yes, if it continued on that trend, that's precisely what we don't know. And that's precisely what cannot be assumed. Now, admittedly, 15 minutes is not a long enough time to really make a solid case for something like that. You have to count, well, how many manuscripts would have existed in that prior period? How many scribes would have been doing the work back then? What kind of motivations would they have had to change the text, and so on. And again, I don't expect anyone to necessarily quantify that, but that's the kind of thing that would need to be answered to show that the problem exists to the extent that has been argued. Now, in terms of the changes being malicious, here's another critical issue. We heard the example of John 8. Now, I'm going to leave aside the question of whether or not that text is an authentic story. I happen to think it is for various reasons, and I happen to think it was authored originally by Luke. But that's not the issue tonight. The issue tonight is it was inserted in the text. Was it known to be a forgery by the scribe who inserted it? Was their intention to maliciously deceive people into thinking that this was an original story written by John? Or did they think, well, this is an original story we found, let's go ahead and insert it wherever we can? The evidence shows that the latter is the case. The story is placed variably in our manuscripts. Some have it at the end of John. Some put it after John 7:36. One puts it after 7:44. Some stick it in, would you believe it, Luke. So what is the evidence that scribes knew this story was inauthentic? Bart Ehrman himself says there are many theories for how this story was added to John, but most scholars think it was a circulating oral tradition about Jesus that was originally added as a margin note to a manuscript, and then was incorporated by a scribe who thought that meant it was supposed to be part of the text. In other words, he sees a gloss, not deceit. In his later book, Forged, recently released, he does not change this view. He does say he thinks the story was originally a fabrication, and does think it was added by a scribe, but he does not speculate on the motives of the scribe. So there's clearly, as far as we can tell, no malicious intent in adding that story. Was there malicious intent in these other changes that were made? That is a critical issue, deciding whether or not we can extrapolate further back into the past. Bart Ehrman himself says in Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, there is scarce need to posit any kind of ulterior motive for this kind of scribal activity. He finds no evidence to suggest that proto-Orthodox scribes, as he calls them, acted out of sheer malice or utter disregard for the constraints of the text. That is, that they strove to make it say precisely what they knew it did not say. Now, in terms of whether the changes made were meaningful, again, that's a rather large debate. Speaking of John 8 in particular, this is a very nice story, it's true, but it doesn't add anything to our doctrine. It's basically a repeat of the event with Caesar and the coin, as I see it. Bart Ehrman has said, in misquoting Jesus, that knowing the exact words of Scripture matters because the only way to understand what an author wants to say is to know what his words, all his words, actually were. But what about the broader meaning or message? Even Ehrman will acknowledge that it was not until near the end of the 2nd century that Christians began attributing canonical status to the Gospels and Apostolic writings and insisting on their literal or word-for-word interpretation. Classical scholar Rosalind Thomas asks, to apply the concept of original and copy to ancient documents is anachronistic. We must abandon the modern concept of authenticity and the modern requirement of exact verbatim correspondence down to the very punctuation. We need to look more at the transmission of substance rather than the transmission of words. Sometimes spelling does make a big deal, but at other times it does not. One of the other changes that I particularly note is in 1 Thessalonians 2, where the difference is between Paul saying he and his friends were like little children or were gentle. That one doesn't make a difference. We don't have time to discuss all these particulars he gave, but I would disagree that many of those are anything significant, at least to me, then I'm not typical. In essence, Bart Ehrman answers that he doesn't think there was any forgery ring in the transmission copying of the New Testament. That's a different conclusion than the one he reaches in his most recent book concerning the authorship, but that's another subject. Many people in this room tonight worship Jesus, and some worship no God, but at this moment, I'm going to pay obeisance to the god Cronus and conclude my time. I'll be preparing a supplemental page, in fact it's already up right now, this is the second one, where I'll include some extra comments, listing of resources, and any other pertinent information. I thank you, and good night.
Thank you. And now we're going to turn it over to Dr. Carrier, and he has 10 minutes.
Yeah, can I get my slideshow back up? And if you, before you go to full screen, can you jump all the way to the end? Is that the end? Yeah, to the last page. There's actually more to the slideshow. Can you jump to the last page? Oh, stop there. Yeah, okay. No, keep going. You're good. That's good. Yeah, there we go. Keep going. Did we go too far? No, we went too far back. All right. Yeah, keep going. Keep going.
This count on 10 minutes?
Okay, here we go. Okay, yeah, I'm not going to go into that. Okay, I'm sorry. That's going to be too difficult to talk about. Yeah, actually, well, I wasn't actually doing your position on that, and I do think you're wrong, and there are scholars who think he's wrong. But there's actually a more important point that I'd like to point out, and you know, I'll just make the general point that it doesn't matter. Well, actually, let's put it this way. JP is essentially agreeing with me on the general points. Spelling errors do change the meaning of the text, and there were spelling errors that we can't detect. Spelling errors were numerous, routine in every century, especially the first three. Many spelling errors were made behind the curtain and are invisible to us now. Harmonizations do matter. They constantly occurred, and they must have occurred behind the curtain. Interpolations were unusually common in the first 3 centuries. We can even see some obvious interpolations made behind the curtain, in my opinion, but we can debate that. But the fact that scholars can't agree on these things, that scholars disagree on exactly what the text said, is exactly illustrating my point, that we don't know for certain what the text was. Now, like you said, we can probably get a general idea of different themes and so forth. We can also talk about probabilities. But when you're arguing from the text of the Bible and say, well, Paul used this particular word, and this particular word means a certain thing, now you're in trouble, because you can't actually have absolute confidence that that is actually the word that he used. And there are many examples of this kind of thing in the text, where the spelling matters. And for example, the angel story with regard to saying that the peace on earth and goodwill toward men. Now, I don't think it's trivial whether, as a historian, it's not trivial to me whether the original author wrote this beautiful phrase, peace on earth and goodwill toward men, or if the original author wrote peace on earth for men in whom God pleases. I think that makes a significant difference in the way that Luke understood theology, the way Luke understood God, the ethics and ideas of the time, and it makes an important understanding of Christian ideas and beliefs of the time. So as a historian, I'm more interested in trying to figure out what the original Christians thought and believed, and what the original authors wrote. And this is where we get to John. It matters a great deal to me as a historian whether John wrote the adulterous story or Luke wrote the adulterous story, because they're both different authors with different sources and different reliability. So, and they have different theologies as well. So the meaning of the story changes based on which author wrote it. And you would say this too. It matters a lot to you which author wrote something, whether it was Tacitus or Herodotus, for example. You would want to know, because these make differences in terms of what sources they were using, how reliable that story is, and so on. And JP said, well, he gave the claim that, well, we can say that the story is nevertheless true. Now, we're not here debating the truth of the Bible. We're only talking about the text. But as a historian, we don't have any actual evidence that pericope, that story that was added, comes from any actual source. And that's part of the problem, the fact that if it doesn't come from John, then we don't have a source for it. So we don't know where it comes from. It could be like that longer ending to Mark, that satanic powers ending to Mark, which we know is completely bogus, and yet some Christians sat down and wrote that whole long thing, giving this whole conversation between Jesus and the disciples that we know is completely fake. So we don't know whether that is the adulterous story is like that, or whether it's an oral lore that was true and got imported. So these things matter. As a historian, they matter. And I think if you're going to start looking at the Bible as a source of information about your ethics, for example, it's going to matter a great deal. Now, in the New Testament, I don't know any particular examples like this, but in the Old Testament, there are disputes, for example, over, which we're going to talk about abortion, for instance. There are disputes over the meaning of different words and which words were in the original text, where there's actual different readings in different manuscripts, in particular passages that could pertain to the morality of abortion. So getting the correct text matters if you think it matters what the Bible says. And there's cases in the New Testament as well where there's things like that, where there's the doctrine of the resurrection, for example. There's a passage in 1 Corinthians 15 where Paul is talking about what your resurrection will be like in the future. And there's something like 4 or 5 different variants that say every possible different thing. In other words, all contradicting each other. And we don't know which one is the original. Well, we can kind of figure it out based on what we think, as scholars, what we think Paul would have argued. So again, that's the kind of reason you have to deal with. And the biggest problem for you as layman when you're dealing with this is that if you pick up a Bible or English translation, it's not going to tell you most of this. In fact, sometimes if you have a good Bible, it'll have footnotes for some of the most contested passages. And that's only if you have a good Bible that does that. But even those Bibles don't tell you about all the different places where we really don't know exactly what was being said. And I brought actually an English, if you want to take a look at it, a copy of the Greek text. What they have is this thing called an apparatus down at the bottom of it. Each page has an apparatus showing all the different variant readings. You can turn page after page after page, and you can see there's this constant variant readings, whole sentences in some cases. And so it's a big problem. And so if you're looking at an English Bible, you're not going to see that part of the text. Where a scholar can pick up a Greek Bible with that apparatus, and he sees, oh, there's problems here. But you're not going to see that. And so that's a problem for me, especially as a historian, the way I'm thinking about it. And I think that's, probably the main difference between JP and I. On most of these facts, the actual hard facts of the case, we do agree that there are errors and distortions in the Bible that we're never going to know about, or that we may even discover in the future with new manuscript finds. There have been cases like that where we found new manuscripts and said, oh, well, okay, we changed our mind on this. This is the value of debates like this, is where you get all this information. I think JP has given you really good information. I've given you a lot of information. So further pursue this and think about these things when you're looking at the text of the Bible or using the Bible to make an argument. And that's all we would hope for you, actually. So, thank you.
What do you think? It's interesting, huh? I was going to ask you, did you fly on Southwest? Oh, good. Okay.
Yes, I held the plane together.
Jeez. The plane, they're saying that the plane, because it goes up and down and it pressurizes and that it wears out faster. I don't know. My wife and I, we're going to be going to Las Vegas in a couple months, and we're flying Southwest, so I don't fly well.
I'd rather have that crack than stringing kids like I had to.
I know that it wasn't until I got older I got afraid to fly, but the plane is coming in and I'm thinking, I hear this below my seat and I'm thinking the landing gear is not down, and I want to tell the pilot, I don't think the landing gear went down. I didn't fly well. Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to take a 10-minute break. Right behind you, there's a sign for restrooms. You go through that door. We've got cookies and coffee out here. Go out, visit, mingle around. We're going to call it back in 10 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to a Q&A. Okay? See you in 10 minutes. Okay, if we can gather back in. We're going to go ahead and go into our Q&A time. And the format for that is going to be simple. If you have a question, we're running a special tonight. One question is $50. What? No, you guys don't vote for that. Okay. All right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have anybody that has a question is going to come up to the mic. Don't be shy. Don't be embarrassed. It's just, nothing's wrong. Nothing's right as far as the format of the questions. You are going to address either one of our speakers tonight with your question, and they will go ahead and give a response. And we're going to also allow the other side to give a response to the same question. So with that said, I have the first question is going to come from Greg, who happens to be the mayor of our wonderful town of Plymouth. Give him a hand. He's going to come up. And after both of our speakers, and they don't have to, but they're allowed to respond to the question, then we're going to go ahead and you just go ahead and come on up to the mic, and you'll be acknowledged, and then you can just ask away, okay? And Mayor Baldwin, take it away.
Now, I have a quick question.
Yes, sir.
Typical politician. I have 3 quick questions, and one's a yes and no, so I hope I can get all
Well,
three.
$150. I know I said $50.
Dr. Carrier, this one would be for you. Israel uses the Old Testament, New Testament in their schools to teach about historical facts and places. The veracity of archaeological diggings done by Israel and many others from around the world is astronomical, to say the least. in its support of the Old Testament and New Testament. My question for you would be, do you have any comments concerning these statements that I just made?
Yeah, what I always do. I recommend two books, and I would recommend read the critics of these books. And JP has criticized at least one of them, I know. And that's fine. Read the book, read his criticism. Generally, often, even when they're wrong, the truth is somewhere in between. But they're really good books because they give you a good baseline idea of the consensus in this view, what the mainstream scholars are talking about. And even when they give their own views, they usually say they are. And the two books that I recommend is The Bible Unearthed by Israel Finkelstein and Silverman, which covers the Old Testament. And it'll get you up to date on what scholars have found regarding the archaeology of the Old Testament and other things like that. And that's a really good book. It's a book everybody should have on their shelf because it's really readable and it introduces you to the whole field and gives you the opportunities to get started. And it's approachable to people. And then Jesus Interrupted by Bart Ehrman. And that's another one that does the same thing for the New Testament. And so that'll give you an idea of throw you into the ballpark of where the arguments are, what's going on, and what we know, and so forth. That's what I would recommend. Is learn more.
Thank you.
Okay. Actually, I commented on both of those books, although on the first one, Bible Unearthed, I do not speak on topics I know nothing about, which includes archaeology. The only critiques I issued on that one had to do with their exegesis of Scripture and certain other aspects of it. I do have a more complete response to Jesus Interrupted, the less behind a paywall, and he might not know about that one.
This is a yes, no.
Okay.
And then the other one you'll be able to elaborate just a little bit longer on. If all cultures lived by the Ten Commandments or laws, would the world be a better or a worse place to live, in your opinion? Yes or no? And that's can, and if as much as you can do it. And then yes or no.
It depends on what you're comparing it with. I mean, follow the Ten Commandments or follow no moral code whatsoever, then obviously you'd be better off with the Ten Commandments than nothing. However, I think there are better commandments. So I think there's actually better commandments, and the world would be better off if you followed them. Certainly, especially because the Ten Commandments, 5 of them, or 4 of them at least, are basically religious that aren't actual moral commands, like have no graven images or have no other God before me. These aren't really morally necessary for a functioning, happy society, in my opinion. I actually have an article on this, and I'm going to write more about it in a forthcoming book on the end of Christianity. That's the title of it. It'll come out. Oh no, I'm sorry. It's going to be a different book that's coming out a year from now. So never mind that. That's of no use. Online, you can go online and find where I talk about the real Ten Commandments. Jokingly titled, but where I talk about what the equivalent of the Ten Commandments, and there are 10 Commandments, in Solon, the Greek, the legendary Greek founder of Athenian democracy. And he has his own 10 Commandments. And I talk about comparing those with the Old Testament 10 Commandments. And you from reading that, you will see where I come from on this issue.
Well, I think you answered my last one is, do you believe that you could personally come up with 10 better commandments than I think you spoke of? So anyway, thank you very much.
Not much to add to that. I mean, 6 of them, not 6 at least, are common like laws that other societies have. And the others, the religious ones, I guess you'd say, were, I beg to assume that God is real. And under that circumstance, if God is real, then yes, it was probably going to be the best thing. But that's another issue entirely.
Thank you, David.
JP, in your opening statements, one of the things that I kind of looked askance at when you said we have, I forget what the number you used was, 2,600 something manuscripts of the New Testament?
Not 2,600.
What the number you had?
It was over 5,000.
Yeah, I was gonna assume.
5,790 Greek manuscripts.
And my question for that is, of those, how many of those are first century, how many second century
I
excerpts?
think there are only a handful each, but I don't consider that an issue because when you compare it to secular documents, you have an even wider gap. So, and again, my approach is comparative, okay? And I think if we just have that, if we just take a comparative approach with no other factors involved, then it's like the dilemma I said. You either accept that you can reconstruct the New Testament better, or you can't reconstruct anything. But again, you have to come up with some reason why the New Testament will be an exception, which is what that forgery ring would be about, or what that appeal, like he made to the various changes would be about. You have to show why that evidence will be overturned.
Well, actually, to keep to that point, you mentioned that comparing secular writings, and I assume you're talking about the Odyssey, Ovid, Homeric. So that what we're talking about?
The Odyssey is the usual, but I've got lots of other comparisons.
Okay, and would you say it's even fair to make that comparison because not only do we know that there were changes made and made deliberately, But the New Testament itself warns us about these people who are writing scriptures in the Pauline.
Well, without getting into the specifics, yeah, that's exactly the point. You need to argue why that stuff, all the evidence, can't be trusted. That's what I'm saying. You have to come up with some sort of paradigm for why we can dispense with all that extra evidence.
Well, let me ask you this then, because I think we're talking in circles around each other.
Okay.
Why is it that if the New Testament itself is warning about the risk of forgery, in itself a letter that scholars say is a forgery, how is it that you don't have that evidence?
Well, we have to get into evidence then of whether 2 Thessalonians, which I see what you mean, is a forgery. I don't think it is.
Well, here's the thing. If it is a forgery,
Yeah.
then there's forgery. If it's not a forgery, then Paul is really warning us that there are forgeries out there.
Yeah.
And therefore, there was a risk of forgery even in the middle of the first century.
Risk is not enough to decide something.
Okay, that's what we're looking at.
Yeah.
Yeah, that last exchange there, I think, is kind of off the topic of today, since we're talking about textual reliability of the New Testament. So I'll make some comments on the issues that came up on that. I mean, one thing I'd like to point out is this mention of like 20,000 manuscripts, for example. Most of those manuscripts, by far, are copies of other manuscripts we already have. And therefore, so you know where the copy comes from. So really, all those copies of copies are disregarded. They're not useful information. What we need is the copies that we don't have the originals of, and those are like our root manuscripts. I think those only number maybe in the hundreds. In fact, I have a complete list. When you buy one of these Greek Bibles, it comes with a little insert that actually has all the significant manuscripts listed on it. And it's not that many, really. But JP is correct that compared to other ancient texts, it is a lot. In fact, we have a lot more, but there are a few exceptions, maybe some secular literature where we have something comparable. But let's take Tacitus, for example, where we only have really 2 root manuscripts. We have lots of manuscripts, but they're all copies of these 2. And those 2 don't even completely overlap. So there's parts of Tacitus where we only have 1 manuscript. And yet we can look at that manuscript and we can see spelling errors and garbled text where it's completely illegible. We don't even know what the author originally meant. There are about 1,000 places in Tacitus where there are either disagreements between the 2 manuscripts or places where the scribe clearly wasn't even paying attention to what he was writing. And that's a problem, and we deal with that. And all ancient manuscripts, all ancient texts are in that same state. Yeah, so you mentioned Odyssey. I'll just mention the Odyssey. The Odyssey is generally useless from a historical perspective. We don't use the Odyssey to make historical statements. We don't, for example, use the Odyssey to make statements about the Trojan War. The Odyssey is actually a good example of a text that's in a really bad state, because it's poetry, things were changed around rather rapidly. But there's a big difference between the Odyssey that was transferred by professional scribes and the Odyssey that was transferred among the public. And we actually have papyri of this, what they call a vulgar Odyssey, the vulgar Homer, that was kind of like what the people read, and it shows massive changes and a greater instability that's actually comparable to the New Testament in its first 3 centuries. Whereas the Odyssey that comes from the professional tradition is much closer to the New Testament from about the 4th century on, where you have professional scribes trying to take care to keep a good text, and yet still not completely getting it right. And the Odyssey is in that bad shape, and there are a lot of ancient texts that are in bad shape like that.
And by the way, that's one reason I don't use the Odyssey in my example. Josh McDowell uses it. I don't use it.
Thank you. Oh, come on up.
Actually, this is oddly enough, my question kind of almost starts to relate to what you were just talking about. It seems that I really appreciate your graph that had this sort of downward slope that explaining how variations gradually sort of disappear up until, I guess ultimately to get to modern times when you've got computer programs that will make sure that your text looks like
That's a good point, yeah. I was going to say they don't disappear, but you mentioned when you come to printing, actually they do.
I guess it seems like a lot of the debate under debate is what happens in that area as you put it behind the curtain, that first 150, 200 years or so before we really do start to have a profusion of manuscripts. And I've heard various social, cultural historians, textual critics kind of have 2 extreme views of this time period. One is this sort of, from the more skeptical side, is the one that says, well, they don't put it like this exactly, but in the popular imagination, it's kind of like playing telephone. The Apostle Peter told Mark, and Mark told Miriam, and Miriam told Yusef, and Yusef told Xenocrates, and Xenocrates finally wrote it down and attributed it to Mark, because that's where he heard it came from, but it goes through multiple ear holes on the way to his pen, in other words. And it's, again, people compared it to this whole telephone game that you just kind of play for laughs.
Yeah.
And they just line up people and you see how funny it sounds at the end. I know nobody takes quite that extreme view, but there are some people who argue that's essentially what happened.
Are you talking about the oral lore that
Yeah,
John
the oral,
Keats-
the pre-scribal tradition, that sort
Yeah,
of
okay, I
first
understand.
At the other extreme, there's other cultural and social historians who say, no, this was a very oral culture. And I think it was referred to even as a controlled informal transmission, this idea that if you're a rabbi or you're an apostle who is sort of taking the place of a rabbi in my tradition, and you tell me a story, it's my job to recite that story to my disciples in turn, and it's their job to recite that story. If they get a word wrong, then they get a slap on the wrist. And then finally you get to the point where everybody's starting to die off and people are saying, maybe we ought to start writing this down, even though we appreciate that writing is really just hearsay and it's nowhere near as good as the apostles, but we're going to have to write it down. So we're going to write it down and we're going to check with people before they all die off and we're going to make sure it's right. And then that starts getting transmitted. Obviously these two scenarios, one presents in a very steep curve at the beginning. There's a huge number of errors that occur at the beginning as it goes from one to another. The other one presents you sort of hit this peak maybe right about when everyone's really dead, but there isn't really this scribal tradition yet, and that's really the peak, and then it really goes down before that. And I'm curious to know if either of you have any input on which of those scenarios, or presumably somewhere in between is more possible.
Yeah, I think the truth is in between, but I would say that would be a wholly different debate. Because if we're going to talk about the reliability of the claims made in the New Testament, like this oral transmission wasn't reliable, we could have a whole debate on just that. And that's why I appreciate the way that we narrow the focus on just the textual part of it. You have to argue one or the other and focus one at a time, because that's a really complicated debate. And like I said, I think the truth is somewhere in between. It's not as bad as a telephone game, but it's not necessarily comparable, for example, to the missionating schools. But like I said, we could have a whole debate against that.
Yeah, I don't think very much. I mean, I did a lot of research on oral tradition for one of my books, and there are some social models that do fit the telephone. There are some social models that fit a very strict model. The New Testament in general, that era, is somewhere in between, somewhat of a didactic model. But then they're also not as concerned, as I quoted that scholar Rosalind Thomas, they're not as concerned with precision. They're more concerned with the substance rather than the exact words. That plays havoc with some people's views of the Bible, especially some of those folks who are handling snakes out there. But they're just going to have to